Welcome to the third in a series of lectures honoring the HOTS program called Engineering in a Land-Grant Context. These lectures have been sponsored generously by the Department of History, History of Technology and Science program, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Miller Lecture Fund, and the Committee on Lectures. I'm Jim Andrews. I'm a professor of modern Russian history in the history department and a specialist on the cultural history of Russian science and technology. Our distinguished guest today is Dr. Deborah G. Douglas, who is the author of United States Women in Aviation, 1940 to 1985. She's been a staff member at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. She was a NASA historian, and she is currently curator of the MIT Museum in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her talk today, her presentation, is called The End of Try and Fly, The Origins and Evolution of American Aeronautical Engineering Education Through World War II. And Dr. Douglas will be taking questions afterwards. Deborah?
First, I want to say thank you to the department and to all of the sponsors of this program this evening. It's really terrific for me to be here. I have related to some of the members that took me out to dinner this evening that 2 summers ago I actually took part in RAGBRAI, so I can say that I have been in Iowa and seen many towns here, but I have never been to Ames, and so it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. In 1935, Montgomery Knight, who was professor and director of the Daniel Guggenheim School of Aeronautics at the Georgia Institute of Technology, wrote a brief article called Aeronautics and the Engineer. And he started this way: "But don't you teach flying?" The gentleman who was asking this question was sitting in my office the other day. He had come in to see me about having his son enter Georgia Tech as a prospective student in aeronautical engineering. "No," I replied, "we do not teach flying for several reasons, chief of which is the fact that flying is an art, while aeronautical engineering is a science." And that's really the subject of this talk tonight. And it is a piece of a project that I have been working on for the past 3 years under contract to NASA, which is a book about the federal contributions to the development of aeronautical engineering as a discipline. There has been considerable writing on aerodynamics, but aerodynamics is not synonymous with aeronautical engineering. The Europeans may have bequeathed aerodynamics to the Americans, but aeronautical engineering is American in origins. What makes the story of aeronautical engineering different is the prominent, perhaps even dominant, role of the federal government in its development. This is not to say that the public sector is irrelevant in the history of other engineering specialties, but compared with mechanical or civil engineering, aeronautical engineering is anonymous. So what I intend to talk about this evening is a piece of that work. I have been very much interested in the formation of technological communities, of disciplines, and of professional identity, because I view them as more useful sites to measure the impact of institution and external events. In this case, trying to get a handle on what is the nature of the federal contribution to this discipline seems to be more easily understood if we talk about a discipline and the way in which we train people and professional identity. But if you flip through John Anderson's Introduction to Flight textbook, and I note that John Anderson is a favorite of the Aero Engineering Department here, visiting the bookstore downstairs. They have 3 of his books on the shelf. Or Roger Bilstein's History, Flight in America, or any, in fact, of the gazillion books on airplanes. And you look for mentions of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or NACA, the National Bureau of Standards, McCook Field, Wright-Patterson, Arnold Engineering Development Center, the Bureau of Air Commerce, Civil Aeronautics Authority, the FAA, and you'll find indeed that the references are scant. Now, it's not surprising that historians have had a difficult time characterizing the nature of institutional relationships between government and business in the aviation sector. In fact, this has long been the case. In the 1930s, there was a multi-year research project called Public Aids to Transportation, conducted by the Office of the Federal Coordinator of Transportation. And he summarized the work of the NACA in a single footnote buried in the middle of its volume called Public Aids to Scheduled Air Transportation. And the footnote reads as follows: "There would be some justification for including the cost of research work of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. Aviation research has been emphasized by the government over research that would benefit other forms of transportation. Owing to the importance of defense considerations in these research activities, and to the fact that no aid has been set up against other forms of transportation for such limited government research as is conducted directly for their benefit, it is considered unnecessary to include a portion of the committee's expenditures among the costs charged against scheduled air transportation." Now, this report represented the single most comprehensive analysis to date on the nature and extent of the federal contributions to commercial aviation. Yet its authors, most of the report was prepared by David Cullison and the economist Paul T. David, made a categorical decision to exclude the NACA from their study, asserting that it was too difficult to assess its contributions in conventional terms. It is frankly difficult to make such assessments, although economists certainly try mightily. One of the things I noticed when I was riding RAGBRAI is that most of the roads were concrete, and you'll know that sort of corrugated pattern embedded in the concrete surface. That's called a corduroy texture. It grows out of research done in the 50s for grooving runways, and then later on for improving runway surfaces for the space shuttle at Kennedy. And there have been countless studies at NASA to try and assess the economic value of grooved runways when it transferred into highway technology. But it becomes impossible to measure. Is it the number of accidents that you didn't have? How do you measure it if it's a new road? You have no standard. In my study of Langley and of the NACA and of the federal government, I have formulated a working typology of interactions in which to classify the ways in which the NACA or NASA interacted with other organizations. And those briefly are technology benefactor, technology servant, and technology gatekeeper. But such distinctions only make sense if you have some sense that they occur within a communal or disciplinary framework. So at this point, I think it's perhaps useful to interject a clearer definition of the term technological community. I use it the way the historian Ed Constant has, who has written that technological knowledge comprises traditions of practice which are properties of communities of technological practitioners. These communities have specific ways of communicating, educational and career paths, and special interest groups such as engineering societies. Again, as Constant writes, these communities are more than simple aggregates of individuals and institutions. The most important attributes of a technological community are the knowledge and traditions of practice that define an accepted mode of technical operation, the conventional system for accomplishing a specified technical task. Tonight I intend to talk about one piece of that story, which is the educational component. Now if you could turn that projector on. It's that button there, just terrific. Now everybody knows the story of how the airplane was invented. The famous photo here of Wilbur and Orville on the sands of North Carolina's Outer Banks is really embedded in our brains. And without referring to any number of the excellent biographies, historical accounts, or even the Wright brothers' diaries themselves, you have a pretty detailed account, like this photo, in your head. But whether you see them as heroic inventors or nascent system builders isn't so important as the fact that the way the Wrights went about the process of design, construction, and testing their aircraft is different from the way we perceive those same processes today. The stories we tell about the development of an airplane like the Boeing 777 suggest different modes of creativity. We speak of engineering airplanes, not inventing them. How so, and what is the extent of that distinction? The Wright Flyer of 1903 was invented by two people with the assistance of a small number of individuals. They consulted a slightly larger community of scientists and engineers who were likewise interested in the goal of building a vehicle capable of moving through the air. But when that knowledge was found deficient, they undertook independent investigations to collect the data they needed to correct the design problems which cropped up. And while not working in complete secrecy, the Wrights did quite deliberately isolate themselves. I hasten to emphasize that the Wrights were not untutored or lucky, nor did they work from a blank slate. But one must consider that it was 8 years between the decision to work on the problem of building a flying machine and the first flight of the 1903 airplane. Now, if you could put this next slide up, that would be great. Turning to the aircraft of today, we see a process which is infinitely more complex. But is it just a difference of scale? No. Today's aircraft are designed within the context of tremendously large and complex technological systems, which Bill Gates erroneously calls the original World Wide Web. Consider that United Airlines employs 90,000 people to maintain and operate about 450 aircraft, or that JF Airport alone employs 90,000 people to get airplanes in and out of the sky, or that Boeing has over 100,000 employees to build airplanes. The numbers of commercial aircraft today number in the tens of thousands. The number of people needed to keep them operational in the millions. The capital required to operate and maintain this system is extraordinary. Thus, to build a new airplane today requires a very different mindset. Even the home builder, those legions who travel to Oshkosh, Wisconsin each summer, cannot escape this fact. The identifying N number painted on the aircraft is as vivid a reminder that these craftsmen are as much a part of the system as any engineer at Boeing. The air transportation system that we know today was largely invented by the start of World War II. One portion of that system involved the creation of aeronautical engineers. In a 2 or 3 decade period, the term engineer was carefully refined. What I want to explore is how and why the shift from fly and try experimentalists, such as the Wright brothers, to university-trained engineers occurred. Now, the formative phase of aeronautical engineering takes place in 4 stages. I will consider each of them, outlining some of the key developments and making reference to the various programs which take shape at this time. The first period is really that I want to look at is aeronautical engineering before World War I. Before the First World War, there was no institution of higher learning granting degrees in aeronautical engineering. A handful of schools, and this included vocational schools, offered a course, maybe 2, on various aspects of the technology of flight. But the aspiring engineer, enthralled with the progress in flying machines, did not have the choice of seeking a baccalaureate or even a graduate degree. Yet there were individuals who identified themselves as aeronautical engineers. There was, in fact, a nascent community of scientists and engineers who had turned their sights on the problem of flight even before the Wrights had made their efforts. 2 centuries of generalized scientific investigations of fluid motion had cohered into a body of knowledge which had come to be known as aerodynamics by the mid-19th century. Could we have the 3rd slide here? Great. 10 months after Orville and Wilbur took turns with their flying machines on at Kitty Hawk. In August 1904, a 30-year-old PhD made a short 10-minute presentation of a paper entitled Über Flüssigkeitsbewegung bei sehr kleiner Reibung, or on the fluid mechanics of very small friction. It was given at a stand-up session at the Third International Mathematical Congress held in Heidelberg, Germany. In a span of time only slightly longer in duration than the Wright brothers' first flights, Ludwig Prandtl, who's the gentleman in this next slide here, introduced the boundary layer concept. It was to be a new paradigm for theoretical aerodynamics, every bit as revolutionary as the 1903 Flyer, and it supplied a research agenda and a rationale for building wind tunnels. Just a few months after delivering his paper, Prandtl was snapped up by Germany's most prestigious research university, Göttingen, where he immediately developed a closed-circuit tunnel. Prior to this time, wind tunnels were open tubes or tunnels, and began developing a research center which would produce some of the most significant figures in aerodynamics and aeronautical engineering history: Max Monk, Theodor von Karman, Adolf Bussmann, and Jakob Ackeret. Prandtl's lab in Göttingen was one of 3 European research centers which would prove profoundly influential in shaping American aeronautical engineering education. The other 2 were the National Physical Laboratory in Great Britain, and this next picture here is of Gustave Eiffel's aerodynamics laboratory in France. You all know the Eiffel Tower, but did you know that it was also used by Eiffel to conduct experiments in aerodynamics? He had a cable that ran from a platform in the tower, and he would suspend objects on the cable and drop them and measure their aeronautical resistance. Subsequently, at the base of the tower, he built a wind tunnel facility and research lab, which then he later moved to outside Paris. But after he retired, this is what he spent the next 2 decades of his life pursuing. The research reports and textbooks resulting from the work of scientists and engineers at these 3 facilities became the core curriculum for the earliest American courses in aeronautics. And this slide, this illustration right here, is a page of the translated textbook of Gustav Eiffel's textbook on aerodynamics, and this was presented in a aviation technical publication by the 2 people that were teaching the course at MIT at the time. But MIT's first core textbook actually was Gustav Eiffel's book. Though the Americans had invented the airplane, European nations had established a tradition between a decade and a quarter century, depending on the country, of supplying governmental support for aeronautical research. Further, the more extensive and intensively competitive European field of contests, races, and exhibitions with rich purses had a salutary and stimulating effect on the technical development of the airplane. Such events had become showcases for national achievement, and they prompted a quest for performance, higher, farther, and most importantly, faster, that did not exist to the same degree in the United States. Now, this fact greatly distressed the small but passionate community of aviation advocates here in the United States. To their way of thinking, aviation was the epic poetry of technological deeds, that it could be used for both military and civilian purposes. Now, within this community, there was a smaller group who believed that the single most important need was for the federal government to establish a national research laboratory. A spirited campaign began around 1910, and after numerous iterations, ultimately led to the creation of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. The process was one which involved close scrutiny of facilities in Europe. And in 1913, Albert Zahm, who was teaching at Catholic University, and Jerome Hunsaker, a young naval lieutenant, were sent overseas to survey laboratories and university programs. And this photo here is of Hunsaker, who's don't you just aspire to a title like that? Lieutenant Jerome Hunsaker was a Naval Academy graduate who'd been sent to get a master's in naval architecture as part of the Navy's official postgraduate program in MIT's Department of Naval Architecture. That is true to this day, actually. MIT is one of the Navy's official postgraduate training sites. Hunsaker was an aviation enthusiast, and he took advantage of faculty interest in the subject. MIT administrators, especially President Richard McLaurin, viewed Hunsaker as a gifted engineer and highly esteemed his leadership abilities. In 1913, 1 year after Hunsaker completed his MS degree and was working at the Boston Navy Yard, McLaurin requested that the Navy detail Hunsaker to MIT to develop a course in aerodynamics. Thus it was in the summer and fall of 1913 that Hunsaker traveled to Europe with Albert Zahm. Now, the elite group of scientists and engineers which had sent Zahm and Hunsaker to Europe did, in fact, have a bias towards European education that ran deeper than the fact that the Europeans were, in fact, more technically advanced than the Americans in the field of aviation. American engineering education, beginning with West Point, like its learned and scientific societies, had always turned to European models. By the mid-19th century, hundreds of American students were traveling to Germany to study in the new laboratories and research institutes. The high point in the German university's international reputation came at the turn of the century, a fact which individuals like Charles D. Walcott, Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, and others were well aware of. Frankly, though, there would not have been much anyway in the United States for Hunsaker to study. There were a small number of courses, but Hunsaker and his colleagues were not interested in developing a course of study for ingenious mechanics. They wanted a real engineering curriculum. Mechanical, civil, electrical, and mining engineering had been in place for decades. These disciplines represented important fields of study at many American universities. Engineers interested in the problem of flight would, it was assumed, eventually have their own departments, research facilities, and professional societies. There was a preset path towards professionalization that advocates for aeronautical engineering fully intended to follow. As historian David Noble put it, and I don't agree with David Noble on most things, but this is, one point I do agree with him on, science, like management, gave engineers their identity. The mechanical engineers had emphasized the scientific nature of their discipline to distinguish themselves from mechanics and skilled craftsmen, and this emphasis increased over time as scientifically trained engineers made headway against the rule of thumb methods of the shop culture tradition. Now, if this represented the ambition of individuals like Hunsaker, it is important to keep in mind actual practice. The design and construction of aircraft in the years before World War I involved substantially more experimentation than theoretical investigation. Before, probably 99% to 1, before 1914, there were about a half a dozen companies building airplanes, and their engineers were generally self-taught. For example, in 1912, the Glenn L. Martin Company hired 18-year-old Lawrence D. Bell as a mechanic for his brother, who was a company pilot. By 1915, Bell was the plant manager. Now, Larry Bell is, of course, Bell Helicopter, Bell Textron today. He went on to found that company. It was not the case that these self-taught engineers were uninterested in scientific discovery or engineering practice. Indeed, the success of the Wrights has been attributed to the fact that they approached the problem of heavier-than-air flight with a systematic method of inquiry which embodied the best engineering practices. While some use the techniques of parameter variation, fly and try remain the single most important method of experimentation. As long as there was no market for aircraft, the companies which built them remained small, economically fragile affairs, unable to afford the skills of a university graduate, even if they had been available for hire. Engineers, as historian of technology Ed Layton has pointed out, are expensive. An industry had to have attained some measure of economic maturity and be of sufficient scale in order to be able to afford the skills of professional engineers. Thus, the paradoxical situation of aeronautical engineering education in the United States on the eve of World War I was that the fact that advocates knew, or at least they thought they did, exactly what needed to be done. But the absence of market demand for aircraft squelched these ambitions and forced a slower course of action. This had a number of important implications, chief among them the fact that the federal government would become a critical force in the development of aeronautical engineering curriculum in the United States. The MIT example here is instructive. The Institute offered its first course in aeronautics in 1913, and the corporation approved a degree-granting program in aeronautical engineering starting in the 1914-15 academic year. In June 1915, MIT awarded its first Masters of Science in Aeronautical Engineering. But none of this happens in a vacuum. It's not simply enthusiasm for knowledge's own sake. Aeronautical engineers get made because there are jobs for them to do. Unlike traditional classical education, no university institutes an engineering curriculum and hires professors without a sense of market demand for the students. In the case of MIT, that market was the military, especially the United States Navy, which, as noted earlier, had already established a partnership with the Institute to conduct its postgraduate training in naval architecture. Now, that was a lucrative arrangement for MIT and one which they were eager to expand. Further, President McLaurin hoped that it would demonstrate MIT's strong desire to become the home of a national laboratory for aeronautics that was still being discussed in Washington. Again, it's important to note that the commitment of resources is proportionate to the perceived demand. The MIT program's establishment really occurs on the cusp and what initiates what I call sort of the second period of development that runs between 1914 and 1926. I think it's important to note that the First World War really changed everything. Though the United States would not enter the war until 1917, the effects of the European conflict were swift and profound. On March the 3rd, 1915, Congress passed the Naval Appropriations Act for fiscal year 16. Among the 25 pages of text were 2 paragraphs which established a National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. The mission of the new NACA was virtually identical with that of the British Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which was, quote, to supervise and direct the scientific study of the problems of flight with a view to their practical solutions. The budget was tiny, $5,000, but it is worth noting that the very first technical report published by the NACA was for research that had been done at MIT. The real work of 1915 at the NACA was to take up the campaign for a national laboratory again. In fact, in December 1916, the Army purchased land in Hampton, Virginia. It's very convenient. My career is kind of traipsed along all these sites here. For an experimental station that would include facilities for the NACA. Originally intended as a joint project, America's entry into the war changed the Army's plan. The NACA proceeded with its construction plans beginning in July of 1917, but the Army Air Service decided to make McCook Field in Dayton, Ohio, today it's Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, its primary research center. The 2 government labs were just one outlet for engineers interested in airplanes. The NACA, if you will, becomes an employment opportunity, again, for somebody trained in aeronautical engineering. But with America's entry into war, there was suddenly a new demand for aircraft. And to give you a quick sense of scale, the federal appropriations for aviation in 1916 for just the Army alone were $800,000. In 1917 were $18 million. In 1918 were $735 million. The number of actual production, aircraft production in 1916 was 411, went to 2,100 airplanes, went to 14,000 airplanes. So just the tremendous increase in demand for aircraft had an important effect on aeronautical engineering, although perhaps somewhat less than one might initially predict. And that's really because the perceived problem for the aircraft industry wasn't aircraft design, but in fact production. And that's this period is when Henry Ford is invited into, and the automotive industry in, to be consultants on production in the aircraft industry. Thus, while the Army trained tens of thousands as pilots or mechanics, there were only two degree-granting aeronautical engineering programs, MIT and the University of Michigan at this time. Michigan, which granted undergraduate degrees, had 34 students in the fall semester of 1918-19, most of whom were there because they wished to gain background in order to qualify for Army Air Service. So only 10 students continued into the spring semester, and in fact only 2 out of that 10 actually qualified then for a bachelor's degree. To tell you a little bit about Michigan, MIT's initial program, that's the first degree-granting program in the U.S., but it's a graduate program. Michigan was the first to have an undergraduate program, and it really, again, starts with an enthusiast embedded in the Naval Architecture and Marine Engineering program, Herbert Sadler. He attends the International Aviation Meeting in Boston in 1911. He comes back and he founds the University of Michigan Aero Club, and he built a small wind tunnel and worked with students there to conduct all manner of tests on aerodynamic shapes. Sadler's efforts caught the attention of Michigan's Dean Mortimer Cooley, who favored the idea of teaching classes in aeronautical engineering. It's at that time that Cooley received an unsolicited letter from a man by the name of Felix Pawlowski, who was a Polish engineer who had been trained in aeronautics at the University of Paris and had immigrated to the U.S. in 1910. Pawlowski had been working as a car designer, but wanted to, being Detroit, but wanted to teach aeronautical engineering. Cooley hired him as a teaching assistant in mechanical engineering in 1913, where he helped in the drawing classes, but then took over leadership of the Aero Club. And subsequently, the following fall, he became their first professor, and they taught their first classes in aeronautics in the theory of aviation, beginning in the fall of 1914. They added 2 more courses the following academic year, and in the fall of 1916, they established a complete 4-year program of study in aeronautical engineering. Earl Loudy, who was the president of the Aero Society, wrote in 1915 one of those, guns blazing kind of letters in the alumni magazine, which says, is the University of Michigan going to blaze the trail? I think she will. We have the men, the means, and the popular student interest. It is up to us to take the lead in aeronautics, as we have in other branches of engineering, and to build up an international reputation that will remain unquestioned. So there was a great deal of enthusiasm. In May of 1917, the first Bachelor of Science degree was awarded at Michigan. But again, their program swelled during the war with the introduction of a special course called Principles of Aviation, which would qualify students for the Army Air Corps service. So again, there's some sense of market here, and the federal government is really supplying that market for engineers and for aeronautical engineering instruction. Edward Stalker, who was a graduate, one of Michigan's first graduates, was appointed instructor in aeronautical engineering in 1921 to permit Pawlowski the opportunity to conduct original research. And the demand for that research work was apparent, especially if one reviews the annual reports of the NACA and the Army Air Service. So there's a few aeronautical engineering students at this time, but there was, in fact, a research agenda. The Lieutenant Colonel George Squire at McCook Field published a lengthy laundry list of problems connected with the development of military aviation, and some of them were impossibly general. For example, continue the development of the mathematical theory to explain the phenomena recorded in the aerodynamical laboratories and to forecast further results, or complete theory of the air screw. Other questions were quite specific, things like engine cooling. The problem of radiation is important. If some substance could be found that would circulate through the cooling system at higher temperatures than water, it is probable that greater engine efficiencies would result. Oils, salt waters, and other materials have been tried with indifferent success. Or development of a fabric as good as or better than Irish linen for covering of airplanes. There has not been manufactured in this country a fabric suitable for use in covering airplanes. So you kind of range from very specific, narrow inquiries to very broad-based studies. This next slide here. Sorry, that's meant to show that to you a little earlier. This is the University of Michigan's curriculum here on the left in 1916 and 1917. And yes, that's right, number 9. That's it. That's your nation's first aeronautical engineering research laboratory there being built. The NACA had a long list of projects, and the dedication of the new Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory in 1920 was the real turning point for the NACA. The size of the professional staff tripled from 4 to 12 that year and grew steadily to 44 in 1926. Of particular importance was the recruitment of Max Monk, a gifted student of Ludwig Prandtl in 1920. Monk replaced Edward Warner, who had resigned as Langley's chief physicist to return to MIT. Max Monk had earned 2 doctorates, one in engineering and one in physics from Göttingen in 1917 by the age of 27. He was imaginative and irascible, and he was assigned to the NACA's office in Washington with the official job title technical assistant, and that was in part due to the persistent anti-German sentiment after the First World War and to various immigration restrictions that prevented him from being actually hired as an engineer. Most of his work was on theoretical problems, but Monk was the creative genius and developer of the variable density tunnel, which is shown in this next overhead here. What you're looking at is the outside of a pressure vessel. The wind tunnel is actually inside that vessel. And that tunnel began operations in 1922, and later on the propeller research tunnel. These 2 wind tunnels, which I could give you a full paper on, but we'll skip tonight, and you can ask me questions about how they work and why they're important later on. You'll just have to take me on faith here, transformed the Langley Laboratory into a major research facility on par with the best European facilities. Monk's presence suddenly vaunted the NACA into the position of being asked for advice about engineering education. But what of even greater significance was the fact that the NACA felt the need to encourage the development of aeronautical engineering programs. In its 1921 annual report, one of the important new initiatives it announced was an educational outreach effort, which indicated that the committee was engaged in the preparation of problems in aeronautics and answers thereto, which will be distributed among professors in engineering courses at various universities, with a view to having the engineering students generally acquire some knowledge of aeronautical engineering. The committee believes that the future development of aeronautics will be aided by even a slight familiarity with the problems involved in the part of engineering graduates generally. In October of 1922, they republished an article written by Edward Warner that had originally appeared in the Christian Science Monitor entitled The Training of Aeronautical Engineers. The Aeronautical Chamber of Commerce in America listed 15 different colleges and schools offering courses in aeronautics, although the accuracy of this list has to be somewhat questioned because it includes the State University of Iowa in Iowa City. And as Amy knows, I called her up and I talked with the archivists at both here and in Iowa City. And as far as we know, they never were offering courses before 1922 in aeronautics. So take the list, you have to take these lists with somewhat grains of salt. The others included the Armor Institute in Chicago, Caltech, Cornell, Indiana, MIT, Purdue, Rensselaer, Stanford, UC Berkeley, University of Detroit, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and an entity they've identified as the Research University of Washington, D.C. I'm not quite certain which that refers to, but if somebody here knows, I'd be eager to find out. Warner noted that the field is so new that its teaching has hardly become systematized, but some measure of agreement is at least being reached on essential elements that an aeronautical course should include on the prerequisites of preliminary preparation. The demand for aeronautical engineering graduates was severely limited, which led Warner to conclude that aeronautical engineering was best restricted to graduate instruction. Quote, "It is best that all the energies of the school should be devoted to the production of a few highly qualified men rather than to less thorough training of a much larger number. Students interested in research were advised to study experimental physics or other fields as undergraduates, while those interested in aircraft design were encouraged to study civil or mechanical engineering or naval architecture." Now, Warner had a bias toward civil engineering unless the student was interested in propulsion, then recommended mechanical. All students needed, quote, "a bent for mathematics," as, quote, "the study of the theory of design, especially of the theories of wing action and of airflow around bodies which have recently been developed, requires mathematical attainments beyond those exacted of the ordinary practitioner in any other sort of engineering work." He had two further recommendations. Aeronautical engineering students should learn to pilot an aircraft, and they should spend some time working in an aircraft factory. It is unnecessary to emphasize, Warner writes, that no opportunity should be lost to acquire practical experience as well as that knowledge which can be gained from lectures and books. Now, Warner's recommendations that students needed practical as well as theoretical training represented an ideal, although it was an ideal which was seen as the best possible path. This next slide here really illustrates what came to be perceived as kind of the way in which America was going to achieve success was this kind of marriage of engineering and design and industry in pursuit of technical excellence. But the actual practice at this point focused on theoretical training. For example, both the California Institute of Technology and Stanford University were home to some of the most prominent aeronautical engineers or researchers, and both offered graduate courses in aeronautics, but neither had a formal course of instruction or department in this 1914-26 period. Warner's assertion was viewed as valid, and it's perhaps useful to point out that sort of the program which is most significance in this time period that develops is at New York University. And that is a model of combining practice. They taught courses in instruments and maintenance and rigging, along with airship theory and design. But the significance of the NYU program is that it came into existence due to the generosity of Daniel Guggenheim. Daniel Guggenheim's son Harry had learned to pilot a plane, had been a Navy pilot during World War II, and had been very interested in aviation. And when NYU decided it wanted to establish an aeronautical engineering program and was looking for funds for that, it invited Harry to be on the organizing committee. And that committee was proposing various strategies for fundraising. And Harry objected at the time and said, I don't think we should go on some large public campaign. I think we should try and find a single donor for this. What he didn't say at the meeting was that he thought he could get his father to underwrite this program. His father just bequeathed a lot of money to NYU. In fact, his father had become quite enamored of aviation and agreed to this in short order. And at the groundbreaking ceremonies in June of 25, Daniel Guggenheim made this comment, which is, were I a young man seeking a career in either science or government, or commerce, I should unhesitantly turn to aviation. I consider it the greatest road to opportunity, which is before science of commerce of civilized countries on the earth today. This proved to be a catalytic moment, and it would lead Daniel Guggenheim to create the Guggenheim Fund for the Promotion of Aeronautics, a $2.5 million fund which was to be expended in support of aviation. Its number one priority was to promote aeronautical education in both institutions of learning and among the general public. And they subsequently then started in January of 1926 to give money away to, in addition to NYU, 6 other schools, which remain the dominant aeronautical engineering schools to the present day. Briefly, these next 2 slides here tell you, though, that 1926 is really important. If you just take a look at what's happening here, this is the total number of passengers on airplanes, and you can see in 1926, and then you see what happens up through 26 and 33, which is this period here. There's an immediate jump. Again here, this next slide quickly reveals again the increase in miles flown. What happens is, starting with the passage of the Kelly-Airmill Act in 1925, the Air Commerce Act in 1926,